What if we could rewire the brain, selectively open and modify our patterns of thought? Well, that's the question we're going to discuss today. I'm Matthew, and welcome to Almost Qualified.
The following is intended for entertainment purposes. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello everybody, I'm Matthew, and welcome back to Almost Qualified, the podcast where I've done just enough research to have an opinion. Today's topic, a very special one I've been looking forward to for a while. Hallucinogens, what they are, how they work, whether they might be a hidden key to the mind, and why researching them is such a nightmare. We're also going to be going over Radiolab's podcast, The Ecstasy of an Open Brain, to see what the science actually says. Before we get into it, a bit about myself, and why I find this all so fascinating. As a neurodivergent kid, I found myself struggling in a lot of ways that other people just didn't seem to, and it led me to thinking a lot about what made me tick and why my mind was different than others. When I got older, I began to be prescribed psychiatric medications, so stimulants, SSRIs, and I could see just how powerful that chemistry is on how we experience the world. Soon I began to wonder, how much of our identity is dictated by biology and how much is psychology? Is it better to externally regulate our brains with medications, or try and find a way to rewrite the fabric of our thoughts? This curiosity led me to learning about hallucinogens. Radiolab's The Ecstasy of an Open Brain frames the use of these substances in a way that I hadn't thought of before. Rather than asking what these substances do while you're on them, so the trip, the experience, it asks, what do they do to the brain after? Because there's growing evidence to suggest that these drugs may be able to act less like treatments and more like catalysts, enabling change rather than causing it, by means of critical periods.
So critical periods are windows of time when the brain is especially sensitive to its environment and it can learn really well and really strong from that environment.
That was, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, Gul Duthan, a neuroscientist, introducing that concept for us. Essentially, in youth, our brains are flexible. We learn and adapt with an unfathomable speed. As we age, we become more rigid. And this isn't inherently a bad thing. We need a stable framework through which we can understand the world. I don't think you want your emotional regulation to be as flippant and unstable as a 5-year-old's. The brain isn't broken, it's just crystallized. But of course, this introduces a problem, because through a variety of factors both in and out of our control, our brains will tend to develop with some unhelpful tendencies. And that is the fascinating idea that Radiolab explores. What if some drugs can reopen these critical periods? Sorry to bother, but this video was sponsored by Nipux.com, on the fastest private intelligence at your fingertips. Engineered for focus, Nipux.com. So what is a hallucinogen? Well, if you've ever heard of stimulants, like caffeine, or depressants, like alcohol, hallucinogens are just another class of psychoactive substances, ones that mess with your perception, mood, and cognition. The majority of psychoactive substances work by interfering with the natural neurotransmitters in our brain. Generally, they either imitate the natural neurotransmitters, binding to the same receptors and triggering the same response. These are called agonists. Otherwise, they might be antagonists, where they bind to the receptor but do not trigger the same response, essentially blocking it out. There's also a spectrum of partial and selective agonists and antagonists, but the primary focus is going to be on agonists. So chemicals that bind to the same receptors, imitate them. Seeing as neurotransmitters regulate our emotional and mental state, by interfering with them we can induce specific useful mental states. Within hallucinogens, there is a subcategory called psychedelics, which I actually didn't know referred to a different thing until doing research. The unique identifier for a psychedelic is a hallucinogen that interacts with serotonin. Specifically, we call it a classic psychedelic if it interacts with the 2A serotonin receptor, which is implicated in mood, pattern recognition, and the like. This includes drugs such as LSD, so acid, DMT, or psilocybin, which is mushrooms. Beyond that, we also have MDMA, which is important for the discussion but is not a classic psychedelic. It interacts with the 2A receptor, but it also does other stuff. It's better classified as an empathogen because of its impacts on empathy and socialization. There are other similar drugs which are also in the discussion but much less important, like ketamine or ibogaine, which have shown promise but in different domains. In this discussion, I also want to put a large emphasis on safety and caution. While the risk profile of hallucinogens, specifically psychedelics, is generally pretty safe, at least compared to other psychoactive substances, I would advocate heavily against their unlawful use. The danger involved in using these substances is mediated by a lot of factors, including dose, purity, environment, individual response, and outside of a medical environment, you just cannot account for these factors. In some cases, they can cause severe psychological harm, trauma, or even trigger latent diagnoses like schizophrenia. With that out of the way, let's talk about critical periods. So how do we actually know that it's critical periods at play? Well, we don't, not certainly. But then again, making any definitive statements when it comes to the brain, it tends not to work out. What we're really looking for is a useful theory to describe what we're seeing. And the start of forming this theory comes in separating the acute psychological effects from long-term changes. What I mean by this is, if we're looking for the potential positive benefits of these substances, it really doesn't matter what changes occur to the personality when the person is currently on the substance. Of course, if you give someone MDMA, their actions are going to change, at least for a while. What we're really looking for are behaviors and trends that emerge after the substance has largely exited the system. By using different substances and situations, we're able to identify these changes. Take MDMA, for example. In studies, when the drug was administered, they observed, as you would expect, prosocial behavior. Given that MDMA is an empathogen, this makes sense, and that is what the behavior was chalked up to. However, these prosocial behaviors continued to persist after the drug had exited the system. But when further tests were done with other non-psychedelic prosocial substances, these behaviors did not emerge. This was the sign that something about psychedelics specifically seemed to be able to induce a change that is separate from the acute psychological effects. And through tests like these, we've been able to build a sort of beginning understanding of what psychedelics are really doing in the brain. It seems to be allowing the brain to access a level of flexibility and plasticity that is only available in childhood. I think that Molly, the other correspondent in the podcast, actually put it in quite a good way.
Just to put that in context, it's like a dude tripping in a corner is in a way having the same experience as like a wide-eyed baby soaking up their world.
Now, the reason that we're identifying critical periods specifically, and not just broad neuroplasticity, is down to the specific way that the behavior manifests. See, the context in which the drug was administered directly influences what aspects of the person's psychology change. When MDMA was given in a social context, prosocial behaviors emerged, while those behaviors did not emerge in an isolation context, and so on and so forth. Through this, we've come to understand that we can target aspects of a personality by changing the environment and context in which the drug is administered. The length of this reopened critical period is dependent on a lot of factors, but is largely mediated by the dose and type of medication that was ingested. Either way, it tends to last between 2 and 4 weeks. The stance that researcher Guldulan had on this was actually quite interesting to me. She likens the vulnerability during this period to that of a child, stating that in the 2 weeks after you do a psychedelic, you should take care of yourself like you're 4. Which I thought was just an interesting way to think about it. All of this research leads back to one of the biggest debates in the mental health space. Essentially, the biochemical versus learned behavior models of the brain. Are different mental conditions simply the response of neurotransmitters in the brain? Is it as simple as finding and plugging deficiencies? Or is it the result of learned behaviors over time? Now, personally, I stand in the middle of this debate. I believe it's a combination of the two. While I haven't looked into many expert stances on it, I would also assume that most people believe that. I think it's kind of insane to believe that an issue of the mind, which is just so complex, could possibly be either one or the other. I think biology largely influences your natural inclination, the type of person you tend to become. You know, if you imagine yourself playing through life 100 different times, I think that your chemical makeup influences a lot of which direction you end up going. But it's your learned behaviors that dictate exactly which path you take. And the slot that psychedelics fit in is just fascinating. They use that biochemical model of the brain to induce change. So, I don't know. I'm quite curious to see where it ends up. Truly, this field has a lot of space to grow. So I guess that leads us to the question of why don't we know more? And we're getting a bit more into opinion here, but I don't think it's a science problem. It's a culture problem. I mean, first of all, there's the legal sides. Most of these substances are classified as Schedule I drugs, meaning they have high abuse potential and no accepted medical uses. And once something is in that category, doing tests on it is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of time, a lot of money, and fighting through a lot of bureaucracy. Beyond that, actually performing the trials is really difficult. Getting empirical data is hard. They affect the subjective experience of consciousness, your perception, meaning, emotional insight. It's all relative. But if it's so promising, then I think the reason that we aren't studying it is not because of that difficulty, but because of an unwillingness to do it. Because the harm we attribute to something is largely based on how it fits into the cultural context rather than its objective risk, I would argue. Because these substances have been integrated in cultures before. Psychedelics, so drugs that interact with that serotonin 2A receptor, have been used by cultures historically for cultural practices. It's fundamentally impossible to study a drug like MDMA or acid or shrooms or whatever without understanding the cultural context that it fits in. But the change in that cultural context is also why so much more research is being done now. A lot has changed in the last 60 years. These drugs have integrated into Western culture in some form. They're still illegal, they're still stigmatized, but they have places now. And so now, even though the legal landscape is still very restrictive, it's also more nuanced. We're seeing very carefully controlled clinical trials begin to emerge. We're seeing special research exemptions and renewed interest from regulatory agencies and universities. In the last few years alone, there's been a lot of progress, larger trials, better methodologies, and more cautious but open discussion about therapeutic potential. If it hasn't been obvious from the way that I talk about it, I think that research on this topic is extremely important. Our perspectives need to update with the evidence, and the evidence is showing that these drugs have a lot of potential. So, are hallucinogens the secret key to mental health? Well, obviously not, but they're promising, really promising, as a tool, as a way to help people who are struggling. But that's all I have to say. So thank you all again for watching another episode of Almost Qualified. I'll see you next time.